Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, you made it to the last video of Phenomenology of Perception. So this is going to be only one, I decided. I'm going to just push through it. There are 3 pages. I've got 3 pages of notes, but I'm just going to go hardcore, and this is probably going to be quite a long video, but we'll just hammer it out in one hit, I think. So this is part 3 of the last part of Phenomenology of Perception, being for itself and being in the world. Last section, which is freedom. And we're going to start by looking at absolute freedom. Now here, basically Merleau-Ponty is looking at, he's got, in a way, I guess he's got Sartre in mind, who, for Sartre, freedom was absolute. We were, as the for itself, as consciousness, we are completely undetermined, completely radically free. And so that's where Merleau-Ponty starts. And he says that according to this way of thinking, this kind of Sartrean way of thinking, nothing can determine us, because we as for itself, as consciousnesses, transcend everything. We transcend everything about us. Personality, physicality, our characteristics, and even elements of our facticity, where we were born, what language we speak, the culture that we grew up in, all of these things we transcend by as for itself, as consciousnesses. We transcend all of this. We can determine ourselves in relation to those things. They don't determine us. Because if anything could determine us in that way, we would be reduced to the status of an in itself, the status of a thing. So there are 2 consequences to this type of approach. The first is that freedom is total. So I can't be free in some actions and determined in others. This kind of Sartrean approach is it's all or nothing. You're either a complete unfettered freedom, or you're completely determined. There's no middle ground. And also freedom is irrevocable. So we can't take it back. We can't lose it. We can't get it if we don't have it, and we can't lose it if we do. So if I'm free once, I'm free forever, and vice versa. These also dispense with causality and motive. So these 2, this way of thinking dispenses with causality and motive. These 2 consequences mean that it makes no sense to talk about cause or motive, because it's my free decision that gives motives their value, that gives motives their motivating force. It's my free decision that makes a cause, that gives it the causal power that it has. So everything comes back to the consciousness. So that means that there's no such thing as cause or even motive. It all comes back to this free self. And even things which appear as obstacles, and this is the example that Merleau-Ponty uses, which is an example that Sartre uses as well in Being and Nothingness. Not a coincidence there. Even things which appear as obstacles, like the unclimbable rock face, are no impediment to my freedom, because they only appear as such. The rock face only appears as unclimbable for a person who chooses to do something with them or to them. So with the rock face, it appears as an obstacle only if I decide that I want to climb it. It's an unclimbable rock face only in the face of that project. If I don't have that project, it's not an unclimbable rock face. Perhaps it's a picturesque view, perhaps it's something nice to behold or something. So no causality and motive, no obstacles. Freedom is total and irrevocable. That's what absolute freedom gives you. Now the problem with all of this, with this take on freedom, is that it actually renders freedom impossible, Merleau-Ponty says, by eliminating the possibility for free action. So what does he mean by that? Freedom in the sense that we were just talking about absolute freedom is prior to all actions, and so therefore cannot appear in any of them. That freedom is before any of our actions take place, so our actions can't be imbued with freedom. Instead, freedom can only appear on a background that isn't free. In the case of absolute freedom, all we have are intentions immediately followed by an effect. So essentially what Merleau-Ponty is saying is that there's no way in which we can call an act free or unfree if we run with this conception of absolute freedom, because it precedes everything. That we can't see an act as being free if there's no possible alternative, if there's nothing else, if it's just intentions and then effects, if it's just effects following your intentions, there's no sense in which we can say meaningfully the act is free or unfree. It's neither. All we have are, like I say, effects following intentions. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that it eliminates choice. And this is interesting. And I'll give you the quote for this. The very notion of freedom requires that our decision plunge into the future, that something has been done by it, that the following moment benefits from the preceding one, and if not being a necessity, is at least solicited by it. If freedom has to do with doing, then what it does must not immediately be undone by a new freedom. Thus, each instant must not be a closed world. One moment must be able to commit the following ones. Once the decision has been made and the action has begun, I must have some acquisition available to me. I must benefit from my momentum, and I must be inclined to continue. So that's a really pretty straightforward quote, I think. Pretty understandable. Choice requires, in order for there to be choice, the choice must have some effect. It must commit me in some way in the future. If the choice that I make now can be overturned just as easily in the future as I made it now, then in what sense have we even made a choice? There's kind of, the choice hasn't done anything. It hasn't produced any kind of momentum. It hasn't built me up at all. It hasn't pushed me into the future. It's just, it just doesn't qualify as a meaningful choice. It's like there's no sense in which there's any kind of gravitas behind it. It's just, it's a very light sense of choice if we're running with this model of absolute freedom. Without, and this what Merleau-Ponty says, without this kind of depth to choice, this commitment that choice forces me into, that restricts my future movements. Without that, there's no Augenblick, which is a nice word from Heidegger, and also that idea features in Kierkegaard as well. That there's this what's Augenblick? It's decisive moment, I think is how it's translated, in which my gaze shifts from one project to another with some commitment, with some seriousness. If we get rid of, if our choice doesn't commit us in any way, then there's no sense in which our choices are decisive. There's no sense in which they have any real meaning to them. So all of this then means that freedom requires an already established field. Again, the notion of field crops up here. Very, very central to Merleau-Ponty. And he goes on to say this: if freedom is to have a field to work with, if it must be able to assert itself as freedom, then something must separate freedom from its ends. Freedom must have a field. That is, it must have some privileged possibilities or realities that tend to be preserved in being. I like that last sentence. Freedom must have some privileged possibilities. It's a nice way to put it, or realities that tend to be preserved in being. So it means that once we make a decision, it's like there's some momentum. Some possibilities are privileged over others because we're already going in that direction. We've made that decision. We've moved ourselves one step closer to this possibility as opposed to that one. So it's not, at each moment we can't think of ourselves as an absolute freedom with every option laid on the table before us with equal weights. Our prior decisions, they commit us in some way so that future possibilities are maybe not restricted, but some are more likely than others. Some are more privileged, in Merleau-Ponty's words. So the consequence of all this, or one consequence actually of freedom having or requiring an already established field, is that we can't choose our character. Our character has always been, our character is what kind of our choice is built on. It's what our choice comes from. So before we even make the first choice, our character has been formed through our upbringing and our environment and a million other variables, our genes, which isn't to say that we're completely determined, but it's to say that there is this field in which freedom operates. And this is the field that we didn't choose, that we didn't have a hand in making, just because that choice requires some prior commitment. It requires some prior existing field. And that is what our character is, essentially. It's one of the ways that our choices are restricted, take place in an already established field. Okay, so the next section I want to look at is moving into Merleau-Ponty uses again a German word, Sinngebung, which means meaning giving. Right, so we've got this idea that we've put this idea of absolute freedom to the side. Freedom requires an already established field in which to operate. So how does meaning giving come into the picture? How do things acquire meaning for us? That's what Merleau-Ponty next wants to look at. And he starts by looking at this example of the unclimbable rock face again. And I'll give you the quote first. "My freedom thus does not make an obstacle exist over here and a passageway over there. It merely makes obstacles and passageways exist in general. My freedom does not sketch out the particular figure of this world. It only establishes its general structures." So here the idea is that my freedom as intention works only on something that's already existing, a general constraint on my freedom. And this arises from my embodied engagement in the world. And this is that field that we were talking about, that already established field. So my intentions, my freedoms don't actually make obstacles and passageways exist. They don't bestow that kind of meaning on things in themselves. Rather, the things are there, the outlines are there. The details are there. All our freedom does is create, Merleau-Ponty calls it, establishes the general structures in which those things appear, by which they take on certain forms for me. So he's just pointing out the idea that we can't get away from the fact that things are already there prior to our freedom, bringing what it does and bringing these general structures to the particulars which are already there. And so our intentions they create a system around me in which all possible objects are enclosed. That's the things I want to do, my projects, my desires. They create a system in which everything kind of gets arranged for me. But these intentions don't belong, they don't wholly belong to me. They don't wholly originate from me. And he says all similarly constructed psychophysical subjects have these similarities in intentionality. Some aspects of our intentions are universal. Difficult to use that word, have to be careful with that, but universal in the sense at least applying to all human beings. So there are just some similarities that are grounded, that are the ground on which our freedom operates and which our intentions operate. So even that, because our freedom works within the kind of intentional structure that we set up around ourselves, but that intentional structure is grounded in something which is not our freedom. It's not my individual freedom. It's how my life has evolved on earth. It's how things are seen by people in my culture. All of these things play into that work to create that intentional structuring dimension to my reality. And I didn't choose that as a free kind of agent. The example he gives of this is in the book. He's got 6 groupings of 2 dots. So a pair of dots here, another pair over here, another pair, and 6 in total. And he says that these always appear, when you look at them, as 6 groupings of 2 dots. But there's a convention underlying that. There's something, everybody sees them in the same way, and it's that which again, restriction is not the right word, but it's an already established field on which we then operate. So everybody sees this pattern of dots in the same way, and that's because we've all been kind of conditioned in this same way through whatever factors it might be. It might even be evolutionary factors, but we're all kind of conditioned in this way, so that the data, the material that we take up and impose our freedom on is already something that we didn't freely create. He also talks about, what does he talk about? He also talks about some arrangements of lines always appearing as a cube. And again, we're all kind of funneled into this way of seeing the world, and it's that way that our intentions and our freedom manifest upon. And even ambiguous arrangements of lines or shapes, they reveal ways that our freedom is constrained, because we feel our freedom emerge in a spontaneous way, hesitantly. And you could think about that picture that looks like a rabbit when seen from one angle, or a duck seen in another way. And the way you see it, whether you see a duck or a rabbit, kind of spontaneously shifts. I mean, you can try and you can exert some control over that, but it's not a purely free act. If it were, there'd be no hesitancy, there'd be no spontaneity in it. You would decree what you're going to see, and you'd see it. So even those situations where there's some ambiguity, even those reveal that our freedom is not absolute, not total. That there's some kind of spontaneity which we don't control. And this is what Merleau-Ponty says about this. Without these spontaneous valuations, we would not have a world. That is a collection of things that emerges from the formless mass by offering themselves to our body as things to be touched, to be taken, or to be climbed. We would never be aware of adjusting ourselves to the things and of reaching them out there where they are, beyond us. We would merely be aware of rigorously conceiving of objects that are imminent to our intentions. We would not be in the world, ourselves implicated in the spectacle, and so to speak, intermingled with things. We would have merely a representation of a universe. Thus, it is certainly true that there are no obstacles in themselves, but the myself that qualifies them as obstacles is not an acosmic subject. This subject anticipates himself among the things in order to give them the shape of things. So it's quite a long quote, but it's the central idea in Merleau-Ponty that without being engaged in the world, being thrust into the world already before, it's not a free act that we're making. Without that contingency at the beginning, there wouldn't even be a world. We wouldn't see a world. We wouldn't see things in a particular way. We wouldn't see the particular things that we do without this original, primordial field being established. Not against our will, but certainly not as a result of our will, not something that we deliberately or consciously willed. What did I write? The world, so the long and short of this is the world constrains us in ways we don't choose or force upon it because we are in it. And it's these constraints that form the ground of every Singebung act, every meaning-giving act. And that's apparent, and I think if you think about it, if you think about how we act, we don't see ourselves as this acosmic subject forcing our will, upon things, forcing things to appear for us the way that we want. Things already appear, and that's really just what Merleau-Ponty's drawing attention to here. Okay, so we'll move into the next section. We'll have a look at pain and fatigue. So this is again very, very much following the line that Sartre took in Being and Nothingness. Pain and fatigue, when we're climbing up that unclimbable rock face, for example, the pain or the fatigue that might make us stop are never causes that act on our freedom, because they don't come from the outside. They don't work on us from outside us. They always have a sense. They always come with a sense. So pain, fatigue always has a sense. It's not something separate from us. It's something we give a sense in the first place. And this sense expresses my attitude towards the world. So we've got, on the one hand, one person who enjoys the sweat, the heat of the sun beating down on them, the fatigue in their muscles as they're working up this unclimbable rock face. So that person relishes these sensations. For them, it's motivation to keep going, to get to the top, they're lapping this up. For someone else who has a different fundamental orientation towards the world, this is all terrible. This is like the worst torture imaginable, and so all of this acts acts on the individual in order to make them stop. So it has that function as a cause on their behavior, just because of the way that they're already oriented towards things. So the way I've just described that, the pain and fatigue are never causes that act on us, because they have an internal sense which we bestow upon them. So are we then free in relation to fatigue and pain? Well, that's the attitude, the position that Sartre takes. But Merleau-Ponty says, no, we're not. We still don't have this relation of absolute freedom to these things. There is, he calls this a great expression, a sedimentation of our life, which is basically when an attitude has been inculcated enough that it becomes a habit. And that's a way of taking up the world, a way of orienting ourselves towards the world. And this sedimentation, this habit, this stance is then privileged. It restricts, constrains, it favors certain possibilities over others. So our freedom has been forced into this path, even if it's by ourselves, even if it's through my own conscious free acts, even if through my attitude towards the sun and the heat and the fatigue in my muscles, even if that is something I have to some degree created for myself through my conscious acts and decisions in the past, that constrains my freedom now. It means that I'm not, when I come before the situation where I'm on this unclimbable rock face, it means I'm not approaching it as a self which is which lacks any influence from the past. The past is influencing me through those habits, through the way I take up things in the world, through my orientation to the world. So we just can't get away from this idea that we're never this totally absolute unrestricted freedom surveying all possibilities equally and then giving them value from a kind of a cosmic perspective. We're always engaged, we're always in the world, and my present moment is influenced by my past moments in which I was also in the world. Otherwise, if it isn't like this, freedom is just as likely to shatter as continue along any project at every moment. And Merleau-Ponty says this past, if not a destiny, has at least a specific weight, and it is not a sum of events over there far away from me, but rather the atmosphere of my present. So again, that idea, we're not, at each moment, we're not surveying possibilities. We're not surveying situation from a detached, completely free perspective. We're engaged, and that engagement carries some weight. It has momentum. We're moving in a certain direction. Some possibilities are privileged in relation to others. And we'll look more at this idea of freedom in discussing history and in particular class consciousness. Okay, so in this section, Merleau-Ponty talks, first of all, he looks at the idea of the way that realism and idealism approach this idea of class consciousness, how history impacts us. So for realism, it deduces class consciousness from objective conditions. So the way things are, it's very mechanical. We're born into this particular family, into this particular class, into this particular social, economic environment, and that determines us in a certain way. For idealism, it reduces class consciousness to the individual consciousness of that condition. So I'm never a worker or bourgeois at my core. Instead, I'm just I'm a consciousness freely evaluating myself in that way. So I'm freely determining myself as what I want to be. I'm never, this is again very Sartrean, I'm never in bad faith kind of linked into this. I'm never 100% a worker thing, or a bourgeois thing. Rather, I'm a consciousness making myself, valuating myself as a worker or a bourgeoisie. Both of these approaches, realism and idealism, are abstract. So it's basically either in itself or for itself. Realism takes on this in itself mode. Idealism takes on the for itself. But they're both abstract. They pull us out of a concrete, lived situation. And that's why Merleau-Ponty is going to reject those and forget cause, forget how it is that I've become a worker or bourgeois, or how it is that I appear, that I am one or the other, that I have a particular class consciousness. Rather than focusing on that, try to discover class consciousness itself. And he'll do this by adopting an existential method. So let me give you the quote. I exist as a worker, or I exist as a bourgeois first, and this mode of communication with the world and society motivates both my revolutionary or conservative projects and my explicit judgments. I am a worker, or I am a bourgeois, without it being the case that I can deduce the former from the latter, nor the latter from the former. So I want to focus on, just emphasize that last sentence. I can't deduce my judgment, my reflection from my project, from the object, from the objective situation, or the other way around. I can't deduce my objective acts, behavior, projects from my judgments, my reflective intellectual judgments. And that's because we're focusing on this. It's a messier situation than that. It's not as clear cut. We can't just say it's this. It's you're in this situation, and that's why you have the class consciousness you do have. Nor is it, can we say that you're in the situation, but you're a free agent, free consciousness, and you've decided to create yourself in this way. Both of those are too abstract, they're too simple to explain this. So the quote continues, neither the economy nor society, taken as a system of impersonal forces, determine me as a proletarian, but rather society or the economy, such as I bear them within myself and such as I live them. Nor is it, for that matter, an intellectual operation without any motive, but rather my way of being in the world within this institutional framework. Objective conditions don't determine me, they influence me, the way that I orient myself towards them, the way that I live them. That's the key idea here. And my intellect doesn't determine me. My judgments, my reflective judgments don't determine me. They influence me through my involvement in these objective situational conditions. So it's too complex to rule, to abstract out from the messiness of the reality and say that one or the other is the determining factor. So as we saw with the embodied general constraints on my individual freedom that provide a background within which our spontaneous freedom operates, the society we live in and the upbringing we had all contribute to a background upon which we exert our freedoms here. So before class consciousness emerges in me, I live it. That's the idea. I live it, which means non-thetically, in ambiguity. It's something which I'm not reflecting on it, I'm not thinking about it. It's the way that it's the background on which all of my decisions take place. And of course it's a background which I didn't establish, but I come to. And so there is an I there. It's not It's not purely objective form. I'm not just a doll being manipulated, a puppet being manipulated by external forces. But on the other hand, I'm not a being totally separate, removed from the situation, exerting my own uninfluenced will. That's not the word I'm looking for, but and this, so even though we've got this, I live the situation non-thetically in ambiguity, it doesn't mean unconsciously. So it's not that it's happening without any input from me. I'm still the actor. I'm still the one performing these actions, doing these things. But it's not. Again, it's just not that I'm completely separate. We can't consider ourselves in that way. We are we're immersed in the world, in the situation, and there's just no way to pull ourselves out and view ourselves in any other way. So if we examine only our intellectual projects, we miss these existential ones. And examining our projects through this intellectual light, through this idea of ourselves as a free consciousness, tries to turn class consciousness into an object of thought, into a concept, rather than something that we live. And again, that's the key for Merleau-Ponty. It all comes back to that existential method, living our lives rather than knowing them or thinking about them. So genuine, which is to say existential intentionality, rather than positing its object, is toward its object. Idealism is unaware of the interrogative, the subjunctive, the wish, the expectation, and the positive indetermination of these modes of consciousness. This is why it does not succeed in accounting for class. For class is neither simply recorded nor established by decree. Class is, prior to being conceived, lived as an obsessive presence, as a possibility, as an enigma, and as a myth. So in other words, their class emerges from this non-thetic, pre-personal field in which we're engaged, this situation, this background. And the intellectuality just fails to capture the messiness of that. As Merleau-Ponty says, the interrogative, the subjunctive, the wish, the expectation, these things which don't admit of black and white, absolute, clear-cut distinctions, these things which are neither 100% this or 100% that, but are kind of in the grey, things that we're doing as agents, as fully conscious agents, but things that we're not reflecting on. We're not analyzing ourselves from outside the situation as a disinterested observer. We're making these decisions from within that field, non-thetic though it may be. And intellectualism just fails to account for that. It can't account for these modes of consciousness. So he considers an objection next, that class consciousness is perhaps derived by seeing ourselves through the eyes of others. So now bringing others into it, and perhaps that's the way that class consciousness is deduced by us. And Merleau-Ponty's response is, yes, that's true, of course, but only in as much as intersubjectivity is part of the background our lives play out on, part of that field again, that field which we didn't create. So the opinions of others they go into this field on which we're operating. So there's still no clear-cut, yes, it's 70% because of the people around you, and 30% because of the situation, the economic situation at the time, whatever. There's just no clear-cut, objective way to view this. It all comes back to this ambiguous, unclear, irrational, non-thetic field in which we live. And it's only, Merleau-Ponty says, because freedom is this way, that is to say, not absolute, but entangled in a field, that history is possible. So if it wasn't for freedom being like this, we wouldn't even have history. If nothing solicited freedom, which is to say, in a way, restraining or constraining freedom, if nothing solicited freedom, we could make no sense of history. There would be nothing, there wouldn't be any meaning to any historical events, because an absolute freedom is determining itself at every point, unhindered by past decisions, by past events. So the fact that we do see meaning in historical events means that freedom is the way that Merleau-Ponty is talking about it. We aren't these absolutely free consciousnesses. Here's the quote: "A revolution would be equally possible at any moment, and one could reasonably expect a despot to be converted to anarchism. History would never be going anywhere, and even if a short period of time were examined, it could never be said that events are conspiring toward a certain outcome. The statesman would forever be an adventurer. That is, he would commandeer events to his own advantage by giving them a sense that they did not have." And so that, I read that a little bit out of context actually, but yeah, so if we were absolutely free the way that Sartre paints us, then there wouldn't be any direction to history, because at each moment the path that we're on could change. It would be just as likely to change as to continue moving forward in the direction it's going. And he also talks about the one here. He mentions this one, and it's I haven't quoted it. I've got a quote here. I'll read the quote and then discuss what he means. So the one: "The sense of events is the concrete project of a future that is elaborated in social coexistence and in the one prior to every personal decision." So there's this one with a capital O. And what he means by this is that it just goes back to that generalized existence, that background, economic, political, social background for others, the other people as well, within which the individual lives, acts, and decides. So he's kind of contrasting the localized individual small o one, which you are, with this wider, non-thetic, generalized existence, which is in which that small o one lives and acts and decides. And it's that generalized existence that he's calling one with a capital O. And that's just because it's not something which is not you. It's not external to you. This is as much a part of who you are as that localized, individualized, small o one. And that's why he calls it one, because it's still you. It's just as meaningful to you and to who you are and to your life as the other one. And so that brings us back to this idea, the exchange between generalized and the individual existence, capital O1 and small o1, is what results in meaning giving. And there's a nice quote which captures this idea. The generality or the individuality of the subject, subjectivity as bearing qualities or pure subjectivity, the anonymity of the one or the anonymity of consciousness, these are not in each case two conceptions of the subject between which philosophy would have to choose, but two moments of a single structure that is the concrete subject. That's exactly what I was getting at. It's not that we have this background here and this individual here, and we're going to pick which one. It's kind of like realism versus idealism. Rather, these are both together. They work together. They're two moments of a single structure. That's such a great way to put that. And he gives an example. He talks about red, the color red, and how red, for me, it elicits certain feelings, perhaps, or a certain disposition, which is unique to me from within my own point of view. But it solicits me from a gaze that presupposes I'm familiar with a world of colors. So there's, again, this idea, it's both. There is that individual, unique perspective, but that takes place on a broader perspective, which we had little to no say in making. And if we don't take account of that, then we're missing our conception of freedom is going to be impoverished for that. All right, it's time that we look at time. Okay, we have to bring everything back to time, and including freedom. So Merleau-Ponty talks about this idea of absolute flow, and the quote, I'll give it to you: absolute flow which appears perspectively to its own gaze as a consciousness, or as a man, or an embodied subject, because it is a field of presence to itself, to others, and to the world. And because this presence throws it into the natural and cultural world from which it can be understood. So the first thing that's interesting to note here is the way that Merleau-Ponty talks about this absolute flow, which is the field of presence, seeing itself as a consciousness, presence to itself, right? So it's as if the idea being here that this is what we are. We are this absolute flow. We are this field of presence, at least as fundamentally as we are the individual consciousness. And that's what I was just talking about before. We are this greater non-thetic field, as much as we are the narrow individualized one. It's just that we normally think of ourselves, we normally lock ourselves in this individual consciousness, this individual perspective, without realizing actually that is built on a much larger base. That's that non-thetic background, that transcendental field, that ambiguous, uncertain background on which that individual consciousness plays out. We tend to think of ourselves as that little one, that little small o1, instead of this capital O1 as well. And so it's interesting to note Merleau-Ponty talking about this absolute flow appears perspectively to its own gaze as a consciousness. So the gaze is from the absolute flow, from that field of presence, not from the little individualized one. So that's an interesting point to note. And he also says this presence throws that individual consciousness into the world. There's obviously some nice links to Heidegger there. Particularly, obviously, thrownness, that's a central theme in Heidegger, but also the idea that we aren't the kind of passivity that that is a part of Dasein. We're not in control of being. Being controls us in some way. Being being is we're being used. It's not right. It's not quite the right word, but we are being appropriated by being as much as we're appropriating as well. So there's a nice sense in which Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger come together here. I also wanted to mention this idea of absolute flow. So that talking about absolute flow does kind of link us into gets us to time a little bit, flow. So the way that time as that whole is in continuous motion, right? So there's that link as well. And of course the talk of field of presence. Again, presence is loaded with temporal meaning. So Merleau-Ponty is really he's just saying that everything that we've been talking about in this video is directly or is grounded in time. So we talked about a field. Well, it's a field of presence. We talked about the way that we're making decisions. So there's a flow to that as well, which is inherently temporal. And one way we can think about this is that this presence, this absolute flow, mediates between individuality and generality, and it's this that grounds freedom. It's this that on which freedom can arise, or through which freedom can arise. And what kind of freedom? It's not that of an unattached nothingness that chooses itself from nothing, and that is a radical, uncaused freedom operating on things which it surveys from a distance. Rather, it's a freedom which is always able to begin something else. That's our freedom there. It's a freedom which, from a particular project, we're always able to start another project. And there's no sense, it makes no sense to try and say, okay, but when you started that new project, it wasn't your decision because you were determined by many other factors. Or to say that when I made that decision, I transcended all of those other factors and I was making a free, completely free, impartial decision. Neither of those approaches work because they just don't take into account the reality of the situation. It's more complicated than that. We aren't reducible to this isolated consciousness imposing itself on a background, on a stage, and nor are we a billiard ball being bounced around by external forces. So our freedom is wrapped up in this always being able to begin something else. And this gets us to what Merleau-Ponty calls generalized time. So while there is no time without a subjectivity, there is a generalized time. And this is a perpetual starting over of the series past, present, and future. And basically this is what it means to say that time is continuous, right? We talked about time always being in motion, and it being a whole. It's always in this movement. And that's what this idea of generalized time is, this perpetual starting over, this perpetual renewing of the present that takes place in time. And so with this in mind, with this idea of generalized time, this perpetual starting over, you can already see there's a link there. We're describing time in this way. That's how we just described our freedom as an ability to always begin something new. So you can see the link that Merleau-Ponty is trying to establish here between that individual freedom and this idea of generalized time. So we are committed, but never entirely, because of this generalized time, because of which again is what we are. We are this background, right? We're not this localized isolated consciousness. Let me just start that again. We are committed, but never entirely, because of this generalized time, which, I love this quote, continuously gnaws away at itself and undoes what it has just done. So this time is always moving, and it's this which gives us again, it grounds our freedom, because it's this that allows us to begin a new project. The time is marching on. It's something which is always beginning anew, and it's that which lets us, which gives us the ability to begin something new. But of course, we're never complete nothingness. And this is quite nice as well. We start a new project from within an old one, and we leave the old one for a new one. So the idea is that we're never outside being. We're never outside the world. We're never completely detached. Well, we can start a new project, but we started it from within an old project, and we're never. There's no point in the middle where we're completely free from the world. We're always engaged, always in the world. And finally, the last section I've just called freedom. We'll just do a quick wrap up here. So freedom, let me see if we can get some closure before the summary. What is freedom? Let me give you a quote. To be born is to be simultaneously born of the world and to be born into the world. The world is always already constituted, but also never completely constituted. In the first relation, we are solicited. In the second, we are open to an infinity of possibilities. Yet this analysis remains abstract, for we exist in both ways simultaneously. Thus, there is never determinism and never an absolute choice. I am never a mere thing and never a bare consciousness. In particular, even our initiatives and even the situations that we have chosen, once they have been taken up, carry us along as if by a state of grace. Cool. I mean, that really is a great summing point, a summing quote, right? Our relation to the world is always already there, but it's also always incomplete. And we exist in both of these modes, both of these ways at the same time. So it's a nice middle path between realism and idealism. And this middle path is nothing other than the phenomenon in which we are mixed up with the world and with others in an inextricable confusion. Existence simultaneously generalizes and particularizes everything that it intends and can never be complete. Cool. And at the risk of overdoing this, I'm going to throw one last quote at you because this was such a great quote. And I'm going to finish on this and discuss it a little bit, as I always do. I am a psychological and historical structure. Along with existence, I received a way of existing, or a style. All of my actions and thoughts are related to this structure, and even a philosopher's thought is merely a way of making explicit his hold upon the world, which is all he is. And yet I am free, not in spite of or beneath these motivations, but rather by their means. For that meaningful life, that particular signification of nature and history that I am, does not restrict my access to the world. It is rather my means of communication with it. That's a great quote, and I think it's a really good way to finish. Along with existence, when I was born, when I came into this world, I got a style which conditions all of my actions and thoughts. Nice. But I'm free. Not beneath this structure, not beneath this background which I didn't choose, but through it. It's through that I'm free. I'm free as this structure. And one way to think about this, and this is kind of underlies what I've been saying throughout this video, that we're not this localized individual thetic consciousness. We're this broader field of presence, this non-thetic background as well. We're both. And it's difficult to think about because we imagine that background as being out there. And so we imagine this must be some kind of weird metaphysics or some kind of spiritual mysticism or something. But I don't think we need to go there. That it's just the way that you live your life, the way that you are conscious, includes this deeper, non-thetic background, this field of presence. And one way to think about this, one way I like to think about it, is that I'm not a separate consciousness, or to not think about it as if I'm this separate consciousness removed from everything that's happening, removed from my feelings, removed from the background, the history, the current situations, the climate, the economic, socio-political climate that I'm involved in, all of these things. I'm not this separate entity from that. Rather, it's that this particular psychological and historical structure that I am, this individualized existence that I am, has become conscious through that generalized pre-personal field of presence that is time. So it just broadens the notion, the idea of what it means to be a human being. And that is where I'm going to finish. Now, so let's have a quick look at a summary. So we started off with absolute freedom. That didn't get us very far because it turns out to eliminate free action and choice. So then we looked at freedom. What do we have? Freedom requires an already established field, which is not created by me. And it also involves a sedimentation of our life, which means that those habits that build up, that propel us in certain directions into certain futures, privileging certain possibilities over others. And this understanding of freedom required an existential approach, which let us see this broader, this wider picture of our existence in a generalized and an individual sense. Of course, we linked everything back with time. We talked about the absolute flow, which was the pre-personal field of presence. And we talked about generalized time as well, which was that perpetual movement of time, what Heidegger would call the temporalizing of time, where it's always moving through past, present, future. And it's through that generalized time in which the freedom to start anew is possible. And it's in this sense that time grounds our freedom. Finally, we looked at history a little bit. History emerges only because freedom is always entangled in a field. If freedom was absolute, the way Sartre claimed, if it wasn't, it didn't operate on this background which conditions the freedom, then we wouldn't see any meaning in historical events. We wouldn't be able to trace any particular direction to history. Okay, and that is it. We've done it. So that's Phenomenology of Perception. Can't believe we're here. I'm going to do one more video on this. I need to make a diagram. I want to make a diagram just to kind of put all of this, or some of it, onto like one page, one A4, just try and get it nice and neat. Diagrammatic form's always nice to make it easy to understand. So I'm going to do that. So that'll be coming probably in a week or so, I guess. But thanks for sticking with me through this. This has been a long series and pretty grueling actually to get through. But this is one of the better books that I've read, I think, and hopefully I've helped make it a little bit more accessible for you as you read through it. Anyway, thank you as always. That's how I finish every video, eh? Thank you for watching and working through this with me, and I'll see you in the next video for that summary. I got to move on to something else after that. All right, anyway, thank you. See ya.